instead of a film is something that you look up to, what happens if it's a collaborator in the room that you're talking to and how they're kind of maybe pitching you good ideas? I look at the Batman, the latest film. Since seeing that film, all of these ideas about how to make something are coming in. I don't look at that film as some intimidating piece of project. In fact, I look at it as a film school or a buddy teaching me how to make a film. And I think we can definitely, be inspired by that stuff.
Today's episode of the podcast is sponsored by Sounder. And Sounder is the podcast host that I wish I had when I started my show. Because when you sign up for Sounder Plus, their premium offering, which is only $12.99 a month, you unlock so many incredible features. Let's just go through their website and see what's included with Sounder Plus. So you get unlimited podcasts, Analytics Plus, automatic distribution to YouTube, up to 50,000 streams a month, customizable Sounder player, support within 24 hours, 4 collaborators, custom domains, programmatic advertising, so you can start making money from your podcast. You can also leverage the power of AI and machine learning with their tools that auto-transcribe your full podcast and then help you generate keywords, which you can use for the title, for SEO in your description, can help you generate subtitles. It's so powerful what you can do with just one subscription of Sounder, which again is only $12.99 a month, which is a steal. But we're going to give you an even better deal because you're a listener of My Social Life. If you go to sounder.fm/plus and use the promo code Jacob at checkout, you can try Sounder Plus for 3 months free. You get a 3-month free trial if you go to sounder.fm/plus and use the promo code Jacob at checkout. Thank you so much to Sounder for sponsoring today's episode. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to My Social Life. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly. And as always, today's podcast is powered by Surf. And this is the podcast where we teach you how to grow on social media by talking to people who have actually done it. People like Zach Ramelan, who has over 96,000 subscribers on YouTube. Zach, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. So excited.
I'm excited to have you here. And where I want to start, before we dive into YouTube, I want to go back to the beginning. From my understanding, you grew up on a farm and used film as your escape growing up on the farm.
Yeah, man. So that's interesting you bring that up. I grew up kind of tracking back a little bit further. I grew up with a handful of, actually a laundry list of food allergies, so much so that I had to be fed through a tube in my stomach. And up until about grade 6, I had that tube in my stomach. I had a nurse that followed me around to make sure I was okay going into school. I was put into special programs. And when you grow up in sort of a bubble, I was probably 2 ingredients away from being a bubble boy if I was a recipe for that. And you learn a lot through that process, and I wouldn't change anything on that upbringing, but through that, you learn new ways of escaping, kind of more different ways than I think the typical kid perhaps finds that, when you grow up and you can't do sports, you can't participate in things that other children are doing, you can't go out for recess, extracurriculars are just sort of out of the question. And I was kind of, all of those things were out of my reach until I was in grade 10. So I really had to find new ways of creativity. And growing up on a farm was sort of the only space to where I could explore those things. And so, anything that I kind of gravitated towards, especially being so limited, my parents were absolutely, you want to go film the horses for the day? You go, kid. And that was sort of how it all kind of started. When you're so limited with what you can do, you're also have small friend groups. I had one friend who was my arm to the real world. And he was the kid who was going to the mall and skateboarding and hanging out with friends. And I was the weird kid on a farm filming animals. And luckily we had this, his name's Rob. We had this amazing friendship. Him and I over the weekends, when I wasn't filming the chickens and horses, it sounds like I'm telling you some fake story here. I promise you, it's not some Disney story I just watched before this interview. This is legit. Him and I would hang out and just shoot random movies. We would watch The Matrix all day and then recreate scenes from that. And since I lived on a farm, there was fun backdrops that we could go do things with. And I was just experimenting. It was okay, let's put this robot toy closer in front of the camera, and then let's get you to stand far away and play with depth and make it look like this massive thing. And so I honestly think being deprived of so many things as a child was actually how I harnessed a certain area of creativity. And having the backdrop of growing up on a farm and being a little bubble boy and having a single friend who was like down to actually hang out with me and do these crazy things was the great canvas to create an imagination that I think was required.
And everything you tried your best to get on as many film sets as you could in high school, right?
Yeah. So as soon as I sort of my burst my bubble, I guess in the other way, I like escaped it. Boy, your listeners are probably like, "Oh my god, this guy was trapped in a bubble. He lived on a farm," um, which sounds like a great plot. We should write something about this. But I, growing up in that environment, and then eventually when I was able to stretch away from my allergies and get involved in a little bit more of a film scene, I had a good friend in high school who gave me the opportunity to get onto some film sets that he had got the access to. And so him and I would go onto these film sets for these local horror films being shot by this company, Black Fawn Films. And I was just like a PA doing whatever. Like if they needed water buckets hauled in a freezing snowstorm to fill up like a bucket of water in this like horror film scene that was all based underwater, I would go do it. If it was holding a behind the scenes camera, I would go shoot it. Whatever it was, I tried to get myself onto set to capture these things. And that was it, man. Like it started doing these indie horror films, then sort of graduated from there.
And so you end up making your own short, right? It's kind of like a proof of concept to get backing from a Hollywood producer to try and do a feature, right?
So yeah, exactly. So what really got me into doing a lot of these things was so horror films were sort of my break into making movies, and that was kind of all I knew of. Since I was doing production assistance on a lot of these horror films, I learned the system really well, made a couple fun little short films with my buddy from high school. And from that point forward, I just wanted to dive more into this industry because as filmmakers, the horror industry is actually a really good leverage point to go into as a creative because it's the cheapest way to make something really effective. Horror is a very inexpensive way to get an emotion, right? You go, and you're like, oh my God, that scared me. It took nothing for me to freak you out. And yet it's a very engaged emotion. You don't have to blow up a building in order to get someone hooked. You can just show a little bit of blood, and that's all it takes. And so it really excited me as a budding filmmaker to go, okay, all I need to do is show a little bit of gore, maybe some effects that we can, watch a tutorial on and create like a messed up face. And there you go. And so my first introduction was actually making a zombie movie. And at the time I was really engaged with this first person music video that came out. It was called Bad Motherfucker. I don't know if your listeners, have you seen it, but it kind of went viral at the time. And I thought, well, why don't you just did that with zombies? And so me and my buddies got together one weekend. I built like this POV helmet rig. We shot this short film. It ended up actually getting some notoriety. And originally I was just going to try and make like some viral YouTube video. And it ended up going to film festivals all across Canada and across North America. It went on DVD on a zombie anthology DVD thing. And the producers of that, I was just on the phone, and being a young, naive filmmaker as I was, which, I think actually goes much further than trying to step on eggshells. I think there's this idea that you have to respect people in the industry and you have to ask certain questions and there's certain strategy. But, there is something about being like an ignorant kid going into in the film scene. And that's where it kind of started. I was just like, hey, like if you like the short film, why don't we do like a feature film? And, and I didn't know what the rules were. So I just asked him and he's like, you know what, that would be interesting. Let's try it. And within, 2-3 months, I went from just kind of awkwardly asking a question to then being on set of my first feature film. We wrote a script in record-breaking time and got onto set, and I was given more money than I'd ever seen before. I was working with actors, closing down streets, shooting this post-apocalyptic zombie movie that I felt way out of my comfort zone to do. And that was kind of the first step forward into sort of this filmmaking journey.
And so when you say record time, what does that look like?
I mean, I think it was kind of a silly amount of time that we wrote it in. I partnered with some of the best people I knew in the sort of filmmaking scene. And so I think we wrote the script, I want to say in like 2.5 months. And, it's happened so long ago. This was back in 2015. So I think our pre-production was like 4 months and we had hopped into making the movie because we had this a sort of timeline. We kind of did a reverse movie. Typically, when you go out and make a film, you write the script, then you send it to some production company or you shop it around and then you try and get it made. This movie was the idea and the distribution was already lined up. So there was this producer. I mean, it wasn't a lot of money. It wasn't like I was doing a big blockbuster. I was given like under 100K to make a movie. But for me, it was like the most money I had ever seen ever. And I thought, oh my God, we have all this money to make a movie. And when you make a movie on an ambitious movie on a shoestring budget, the money goes like that. I went from having all this money in my bank account to $0 before like we were even halfway done shooting. Regardless, the process happened so fast that the script probably wasn't the greatest. The execution of the film was as good as we can make it, I think, for our young naive age. And at the end of the day, any of your listeners can probably go watch the movie on Amazon Prime. It's not the greatest movie. Please do not anticipate a fun film. It's a movie made by a kid fresh out of high school who was given more money than he knew what to do with, and it made with a bunch of friends where we would shoot the movie from because it was all night shoot, so we'd go shoot at night and then work our way into the morning. In the morning, we would go into we go into the backyard of the house that we were shooting at. We drink beers, get stoned, go to bed, and then start again the next night. And we did that for 2 weeks straight. So that might reflect in the film that you watch. We were also writing the script as we shot it because I actually hadn't finished the script. So my partner at the time, we'd shoot all day, and then stoned in the morning, me stressing out, pulling my hair out, we then write it in the backyard because we would change a scene. I'd get a new idea. It is a very counterintuitive way. And the other thing that the film was so counterintuitive with was the fact that it was all first person. So we were diving into new territory. No one in Canada at this time had ever shot a POV feature. And actually, to reference, there was no feature POV film in the world. So there was no movie I could watch to kind of get inspired from other than GoPro films. So it was all new territory. Any filmmakers who I looked up to or who were kind of mentoring me at the time, I'd ask, they kind of shake their head and be like, good luck. And so it was a very interesting journey as a young budding filmmaker.
And so despite you saying that it's not the greatest movie in the world, I'm still curious what it feels like. Because for context for you, I started writing screenplays last year just for fun. So I wrote 4 features last year. But I'm curious what it feels like to sit in a theater and watch your own movie on the big screen.
First off, congratulations on writing 4 screenplays. That is a huge success, dude. That's no simple feat. And as I know from writing a screenplay in my backyard stoned after filming something, dude, it's painful, man. It's probably one of the most painful things. There's this, the whole time you're shooting a movie, the thing that plays in your head is, I can't wait to be dressed in a suit, watching this with a group of people and cheersing champagne at the end of the theater and receiving my award. But when that moment comes, you're like, I just want to go into the corner of some room and cry my eyes out and hope to God no one sees this thing. I can remember the entire movie, I had my hands over my face. I was like the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, like those little monkey things. I was ears covered, eyes covered. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to watch it. And, every miniature error that happened throughout the movie, I remember just my heart sinking. I felt like I was going to throw up. And it wasn't, we had a packed theater. When we did the first premiere, we sold out. People waited out. It was one of those cliche scenes that you see in when a movie premieres. People are standing out in the pouring rain to see this film. It was literally like a blockbuster. People were lined up, and so I was like, oh my God, there's so much pressure. And yeah, it's not glamour. I actually, anybody who is excited to premiere their movie, I'm going to say it right now. It is not as exciting as what you think it is when you're filming the movie. In fact, the better feeling is when it goes to black, everyone claps and then it's done. The actual showing is so painful.
That is not the response I thought you were going to say. So that's very interesting. And why is it just because you I'm curious if those little mistakes that you are so worried about will everyone else catch them? Or is it you as the creator of this film, you know that those little mistakes are there, but they're so small that the audience won't even realize?
It's a great question, dude. It's amplified. All of the problems are amplified in your own head. It's like, hey, I this is my beliefs on everything. My beliefs on how a movie should be made, my beliefs on how a script should be made, now on a big screen in front of everybody, and everyone's judging it. That's what's going through your head, right? When you premiere a movie. Not, I made this beautiful piece of art and everyone's appreciating this art that I put into the world. No, it's like, hey, here's my therapy that I'm now just projecting in front of everyone. And now you're going to judge it. And now you're going to like, because people when you watch a movie, you're critical, and everyone in the audience, like 50% of the audience was other filmmakers. So you know that they're looking at the technical stuff. The movie was also advertised as a technical movie. It's POV. So it's all in your head. And so when I did the premiere, also leading up to it, there was a round of reviewers, local Toronto reviews that had come out, and they reviewed my other movies beforehand, and I'd gotten some great praise on the original short film, and so I was really excited to hear what people were going to say about the feature. They grilled it, destroyed it. Like, I was so destroyed going into the theater because I'm like, okay, people are just going to hate this. And leading up to it, that's why my hands were over my eyes. Now, when I premiere a movie, I have a little bit more thicker skin. Two, I'm more confident in the stuff that I make. And three, I actually like the stuff that I do. And so there's a little less fear at publishing it. And, I think actually being an online creator really helps with that. At the time, I'd only, done a few YouTube videos and that was it. And in the last 6-7 years since we made that movie, I've consistently published stuff on the internet. And I think it's one of the greatest tools outside of like learning how to be a consistent creator and building a brand and all that fun stuff. What I think online creativity does is it allows you to deal with criticism and feedback much better than I think any other system. You're literally getting feedback every day, all the time, on videos that are old, new, et cetera, et cetera. Traditionally, when you make a film, you work 6 months to a year and a half on a project. Since this was a feature, I worked a year and a half on in this movie. And premiering it was like a year and a half of buildup to then get feedback. The difference between that and a YouTube video is a YouTube video could take anywhere from 5 hours to a day's worth of work, and then you're published, and then it's out, and then it's recycle, rinse, repeat. And what that does above the traditional filmmaking system is you gain a tremendous amount of skill of the full filmmaking process, beginning, middle, and end. You obviously learn consistency and all the fun stuff that people like to talk about YouTube for. But I think something that is a true value is you learn how to receive and give feedback. And that's something that, again, traditional filmmaking is so hard because you have so much of a gap between projects. But for this, if you're constantly getting feedback. A video that I even released, 5 years ago, still getting comments on it. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. And you learn a lot from that feedback, more so than any other filmmaking process. So between now and the time that I made the feature, I've learned so much better about how to receive feedback, how to use it as a tool, and also how to disregard feedback that just won't affect me. And I think that's actually a skill, if I can recommend to any creatives who are listening to this, is something to lean into, is to leverage the fact that there is a space where you can literally get better at receiving feedback on. And I think there's a great quote from, I think it's Casey Neistat, but he says that the worst criticism or the hardest criticism to receive is the stuff that's somewhat inherently true.
I'm curious what some of those kind of filters you apply to feedback as you receive it to know what you should take on, how to take it on. There's like, I know with screenwriting specifically, there's a thing like people can tell you what's wrong with your script, but they can't tell you how to fix it. So never listen to feedback that's trying to tell you how to fix it. But what are some ways you process feedback now, all these years later, since that first film and since the last 6-7 years of posting online?
Yeah, that's awesome, man. It's interesting you brought up that rule about screenplay writing. I want to circle back to that if I remember it. With online creating, the big thing that I learned, it's actually a quote that I heard from Casey Neistat, which is the criticism that hurts the most is probably stuff that's closest to be true. And I took that especially with a lot of the feedback that I was getting at the time. Like throughout my career, the amount of feedback as far as negative criticism has gone has kind of like declined in the success of me kind of learning what my voice is. And I think that's something for us to look at. Like YouTube provides genuine analytics of bad feedback versus good feedback. And the better you are at, speaking your voice or speaking your language, now there's going to be haters. And this is why knowing that Casey Neistat rule is really important, because the feedback that's just haters, you're going to know how to siphon through that really quickly. You're going to be like, well, this is just someone who's like insecure or hates life, and I'm a target. And that's no disrespect to haters, but I mean, they, sometimes, a lot of people use the internet as being a keyboard warrior and just like hating on people. And that is, if you know that rule in your head, okay, this is not going to hurt my feelings because I know this is just a hurt person hurting people. Then there's the other aspect where it's like, ooh, that's felt like a jab. For example, a jab that I used to get was the fact that my videos looked like I was copying a famous filmmaker on YouTube, Peter McKinnon. And people are like, oh, this is so cringy. You're copying him. This is disgust. Like, oh, like how, get your own voice, do your own thing. You're so unoriginal. And that feedback hurt so much when I was receiving it. And at first I wanted to like respond back and be, keyboard warrior back and do the fight thing and defend myself. But when you start to get defensive, that means maybe they're penetrating something that's true. And so I listened to that advice that Casey gives in a video, and I started digesting it. And I thought, okay, let me go back to the drawing board and see if any of this actually is true. And it was. And from that, I started recreating, I think, my own brand using the negative feedback that hurt as a tool. And I think that's how you can use it is, okay, what are they saying that actually works? Because anybody who's genuinely giving feedback, not as being a hater, but as someone who actually just wants you to succeed. At the end of the day, criticism can be used as a format to help someone. Oh, you're doing this wrong, which means, okay, what can I learn from that? The feedback that I got on my first feature, as much as all that criticism hurt my guts at the time, now, years later, it was kind of the best curriculum or the best teachings as being a filmmaker. We all know what it's like when our parents or loved ones say, "Oh, great job," and you're like, "That doesn't help." I love my mom to pieces. She's fantastic, but every movie I show her, she's this is great, and it's like, that's not the feedback I was wanting, Mom, but I really appreciate it. And so when you get feedback that hurts or that is a stinging feeling, it helps in the long run, I think, if you can get past it.
So I'm curious. So with that, I've heard that Casey quote and I understand where it's coming from and I do agree with it to an extent, but I often feel as though creators are sometimes their harshest critics. So sometimes a thing that you might, if something hits you personally as a creator with like a hate comment on YouTube or something, you also might be judging your own stuff very harshly that most people wouldn't necessarily catch on to those things. So how do you kind of balance of using those hate comments or those negative comments as a guide, but also not letting it be too harsh on yourself, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and that's a great point. I definitely feel that it takes a repetition makes the master, and you have to do things multiple times in order to build thick skin. Your first round of feedback, you're never going to receive well. If your first video that gets haters or bad feedback is not going to hurt, and I think this is going to hurt, and this is where the saying consistency is key. While consistency is key for analytics, for skill, for all these other things, I think it's important to be able to learn what your voice is. You're not going to figure out who you are, what your brand is, how to receive feedback on your first 10 videos, first 10 podcasts, first 10 songs. It takes many versions and iterations of rinsing, repeating, receiving feedback in order to learn what truly is you. And it does hurt, and it can affect you negatively as far as what your voice is. But I do think consistently living and breathing what your, let's say, visual or auditory brand is allows you to kind of fight through the bullshit of negative feedback and really understand what your thing is. Because if you are, you've done, 5 things and someone gives you some feedback and you're like, oh man, maybe they're right. And that's you listening to their feedback is a sense of lack of confidence, which like I hit early in my film when I was doing stuff. Like before I got called out for the Peter McKinnon comments, like I would get called out for so many things of that were kind of cringy. And then I would allow that to guide me in my journey. But I always, anytime that I felt kind of misguided, I'd look at my compass and go, no, like what I was doing before, I was going in a good direction. I'm going to go back into this, but kind of tweak and modify. I think feedback shouldn't be used as rule of thumb or Bible or your only compass. I think we're all given a sort of internal compass that guides us to what we want to do. And feedback and criticism is, let's say, 5% of what we should listen to. And the rest should be how we feel about where we want to direct ourselves. But I think consistency is the key in learning about what we should be guided by and what we should listen by others. It's the same as like, if you want to go on vacation somewhere and someone's like, yeah, but the food kind of sucks. And you're like, oh, well, I'm not going on the trip. That's it. Food's terrible. If you really want to go on the trip, you're going to listen to your own guide of, I want to go travel there. I want to go see the backdrop. I want to meet the people. Like, I don't care about the food. But you need to be able to learn how to listen to yourself over feedback. And again, I think it's the repetition that makes the master in that sort of practice. But I'd be interested to hear what your kind of perspective is on that, because obviously you're saying with script writing, and you said that, you kind of maybe a bit of a different perspective.
Yeah. So for me, and I haven't really gotten a lot of, with the screenwriting in particular, I haven't really shared a lot of those scripts yet. So it's like I haven't gotten a lot of feedback on them, so I don't have the best perspective when talking about this. But I think that quote really rings true for me, is no one will be able to tell you how to fix it. They'll just be able to tell you what's wrong. So for me, I kind of try, even with social content, I try to filter through and see if there's a theme emerging, and not necessarily listen to how to fix my videos based off what they're saying, but there's clearly something wrong here. So then it gives me kind of a constraint to play within for my creativity as to how to improve that. It's just kind of, to your point with the compass, it's kind of giving me a direction, but it's not telling me exactly where to go, if that makes sense. I have to figure out how to get there, but this is just kind of point me in the right direction.
Of course, man. And I think that there's also the train of thought. Like I literally just got a phone call with one of my writing partners, Neil, just before this call. And there was an idea that I've like been formulating in my head. It's like this full movie idea. And then I pitch it to him. And we always have these, I love talking to him because we have these back and forth conversations where I'll pitch him something I'm so stoked about. And then he'll bring up the errors in it and be like, well, I don't think that actually works. And what can happen is it can go one of two ways. One, we break it apart and we kind of bounce it back and forth until he stops asking those questions and it gets to a good point. Or, I'll fight for what I want so much so that it justifies it. I think there's a certain element to focus on, which is maybe what you're pitching is just so outside of the box that people are going to give negative feedback on it, or just feedback on it because it's different. But if you're so strong about it that you are willing to keep hitting against the wall of feedback to break through it, then that's actually how really cool stuff's made. If you're very like, no, this is exactly how it's going to be. And we've seen movies about this, whether it's the Steve Jobs films or the Facebook things, like those who are almost like ignorant to feedback and like blind confidence going into something can sometimes be more powerful than I think open to receiving feedback. And so there are things, because at the end of the day, like I think the world is built off of standards that we all live in. And so the idea of like, oh, movies aren't made this way, podcasts aren't recorded this way, songs aren't recorded this way, that's just something that someone did, right? It's like, let's say Spielberg is the standard for making movies. If I make that my only standard of how to make a film, then every other outside of the box idea that I make that's not Spielbergian is going to seem wrong. Right. And so, of course, anybody, if let's say Spielberg's the only filmmaker in the world, everyone's going to look at my stuff and be like, that's not how you make a movie. You don't shoot them that way. And I think we kind of put ourselves in these boxes of that there are certain things that we need to live up to. And those things are what we declare as perfection. Right. But at the end of the day, I don't think there's any such thing as a perfect thing or a certain standard. I think we all need to sort of redefine our own standards of who we are and what we do. And that's how we sort of create unique voices that can stand out. When I did Dad Rush, the film that I talked about, at the time, there was no POV movies, never. So that's why when I asked a filmmaker for advice, they were kind of like, good luck, man. That sounds cool. But ooh, like they would give me this look of fear. And that's because I was breaking the standard by creating it. So I think there's a couple different trains of thought to go into this, but at the end of the day, I think we need to sometimes activate our blind confidence into going things and just go with our gut and internal compass and be like just tapped into right direction with feedback, not fully pushed.
I kind of want to jump back to that Peter McKinnon comment that you got, and kind of along the lines of this conversation we're currently having with, you kind of have to trust yourself, be creative, and just develop your voice. But I also, there's the quote, the greatest artists steal. And so I think a way to find your voice is also try to create like the people you admire, and then layer on the different people you've emulated to kind of create your own voice. So yes, you don't want to end up being exactly like a Steven Spielberg, but you could try to emulate Steven Spielberg and see what you like and what you don't. And that's how you separate yourself, by trying to emulate your idols and then finding your voice throughout. Like, I don't know if that resonates with you, but I'm curious how you went about finding your voice.
Yeah, great point. Like I kind of maybe obsessed over these negative feedbacks so much so that I kind of dove into like creating like a guide to doing this. And so I sort of created like a rule book for myself to work off of, which was like just certain like my top 5 rules. And then I made a video about it. The video did pretty well. And then I'm like, okay, like maybe there's something here. And I dove deeper and deeper into like, how do I find my authentic voice? And, 3 years later, I wrote a whole book about it. So it's great that you brought that up. But, to find that authentic voice that we have, I think we're kind of ignorant to how inspiration is created if we don't look at the fact that we're constantly influenced. Everybody is influenced by a number of things. They say you're the makeup of the 5 people you surround yourself with. That I believe is incredibly true. But I also think we're the makeup of the media we consume, the music we listen to, and our traumas that we grew up with. And again, if we decide to think that that's not real, then we're basically being ignorant to how humans operate in the day-to-day life. That's why marketing is really effective. That's why you're wearing the clothes that you wear. You decorate the house the way you decorate it. It's because you saw it somewhere, liked it, and you decided to put it into your environment. And so if we operate by those rules, then, in certain ways, we can probably hack it. We can modify. We can change the songs that we listen to. We can try and watch different things. And that's what I started experimenting with, is like, if I'm constantly being called a copycat for, let's say, someone like Peter McKinnon, then what happens if I just stop watching his stuff and I start watching the exact opposite? Maybe it's not YouTube tutorials I get inspired by to make YouTube tutorials. Maybe I watch Vimeo staff pick or some weird art house films and then do a tutorial. What would that make? Once if I stop listening to stock music off stock music websites, start listening to some like weird abstract stuff, and then try making things. And what this does is it gives you a new blank slate. Your quote that you said that it's like good artists copy, great artists steal. It's like a riff off of like Pablo Picasso, but he even stole that from somebody else, and that's like a modification. That quote on its own is the representation of that, because that is stolen from many different things. But what I think is truly interesting about that is the fact that if we can constantly steal, not copy, we're going to make something great. I think that the rule of creating something authentic is not going into it being like, I'm going to make something super duper original. And you go in and you're like, well, I'm going to make a movie about cats in space that light fires and are also like intergalactic warriors who fight a pen. Like that is not good. It's a super terrible idea. Like even you as a screenwriter are looking at like, why would you even say that? That's me trying to make something no one's ever seen. It's so original, untouched. But we know that's not going to be a successful idea despite it being original. But if, let's say, I look at my top 3 favorite space films, 2001 Space Odyssey, I look at a movie, let's say like Avengers, and then I take, a Western film, and I put those movies together. That's actually probably Star Wars. But every great film that you look at is the accumulation of 3 to 4 great ideas pieced together. You look at any superhero movie or any sort of excellent film or media or art piece, I guarantee it wasn't just someone putting words together to create something. They looked at things that had influenced them, whether it was voluntarily or subconsciously. That's how stuff was made. Podcasts or radio show interviews pieced together that work really well as that. YouTube is like people shooting stuff on their cell phones mixed with all these other things to create that platform. Platforms, media, all that stuff are great ideas put together, not random ones assembled just to be unique.
Yeah, I think an interesting way to look at this is with the new Batman movie and the Christopher Nolan trilogy. Have you seen both those? We'll say The Dark Knight and the most recent Batman. Have you seen both those films?
You're speaking to me, dude. I've seen the new Batman movie 4 times, and The Dark Knight's my favorite film.
All right, perfect. And so, like, because The Dark Knight is like they took Batman and they put Batman into a thriller movie. It's like almost if you, I haven't seen Heat, but from my understanding, it's like if you took Batman and you dropped him into Heat and you let them have a baby, that's what The Dark Knight is. Versus when you take the new Batman, it's like putting him into a detective film. So it's like if you had Seven and Batman have a baby, that's the new Batman. And I think it's just interesting to see how you can take one character and mix it with different genres and create two very distinctly different films, but that are both still Batman.
Yeah, dude. It's so funny you bring up Heat. So I never watched Heat either. And The Dark Knight's like my favorite movie. So I like watched Heat because I had heard that. And I was literally like, no, this is literally The Dark Knight. Like the way it's shot, the way it's done. And you're right. And literally it's just like if Batman was in there, and it's the same for Seven. So I totally agree. It's like genre smashing. Two things even pieced together can create something unique. Like if you ask anyone about the Batman, they're going to say, oh my God, it's so original. Wow, I've never seen anything like that before. But it's like, yeah, you have. It's Seven. It's literally Seven with Batman in it. Heat is literally The Dark Knight. So yeah, I agree, man.
Yeah, no, 100%. I'm curious for you. Actually, before we get into how you come up with ideas, I want to talk about limitations being a source of creativity, because I feel like a lot of creatives, they often want a blank slate. I want to be able to do anything, create anything, but that can be an overwhelming thing. And it's almost hard to create anything when that's what you can create. But applying limitations, I feel like, can enhance your creativity. Like if you're merging Batman and Seven, that gives you a box that you have to play within. Like it's going to be grounded, it's going to be gritty, it's going to be realistic. There's not going to be magic and superpowers and stuff like that because it's grounded like that, and because those are the constraints you've put on it. So I'm curious if you use constraints when you're creating yourself.
Yeah, so you brought up Seven, which is a great example because David Fincher, the director of that movie, he says a great quote about visual effects, and I'm kind of modifying it here, but visual effects is not about what you show, but rather what you don't show. When you get to a Hollywood level and being at a skill of David Fincher's level, he could have dragons and magic, like you said, and stuff. And David Fincher is actually one of the most VFX driven directors. But if you watch his movie, you don't see any visual effects. But that's because he just enhances things with it. He doesn't do Avengers in Seven. He doesn't, the girl with the dragon tattoo, he's not riding a unicorn. While he has the capabilities of doing that, the budget, the actors, the crew, everything to do that, he doesn't do that. And great filmmakers, great creatives create a box for themselves to live within. And I think limitations is something that's very stigmatized within the creative world. But in fact, I think it's one of those things that we should leverage more often, because that's how you make great things. And for an example, like anybody who I work with, when I work on a project, I say I don't want a canvas of infinite size. I'd much rather know the size of my canvas and work within it. And what that does is you're able to be more creative with that space. I think a lot of us creatives think that if I have every tool imaginable and I could shoot anywhere and do whatever and have infinite budget, like the constant thing most filmmakers say is I don't have enough money. That's always the ongoing thing indie filmmakers say. But the reality is lack of money actually makes you think outside of the box to come up with better ideas. And I'm probably shooting myself in the foot. And there's a future Zach who's like, no, you just need money. But I honestly, when you have the bare basics to make a film, which, let's say you have lighting, lenses, camera, actors, money can only take you so far. Creativity actually doesn't thrive on more assets and more resources. I would actually argue that it thrives on a box to work within. And that's how you can see filmmakers make movies in one location and win an Oscar. That's how you can see certain scripts off of just one actor playing one role, go to Cannes. That's creativity at its finest. And I think perhaps the abundance of tools is really what's making creativity not as good as what it could be.
So when you're starting kind of from square one? How do you come up with ideas, whether that be for a script, a movie, a YouTube video? What's that process look like for you?
It's always different. Like I have sort of my go-to things that I like to do. One is like to go for a walk and talk to myself like a crazy person. I've done it since I was a kid. I'll just like, and luckily I have a dog now, so I'll take my dog for a walk and it'll just look like I'm talking to my dog. But in reality, I'm just speaking to myself, playing multiple characters within a scene. Um, Other times I'll just sort of like, I'll smoke a joint and just like write on a piece of paper, just some ideas that kind of flow through my head. I think the best format is similar to what we were talking about earlier, which is leveraging influence, seeing a good movie, listening to a great song, and being like, okay, like what can I riff off of this? Imagining if instead of a film is something that you look up to, what happens if it's a collaborator in the room that you're talking to and how they're kind of maybe pitching you good ideas? I look at the Batman, the latest film. I think it's one of the greatest inspiration pieces of any piece of art that I've at least consumed in the last 10 years, probably since The Dark Knight. And since seeing that film, all these ideas about how to make something are coming in. I don't look at that film as some intimidating piece of project. In fact, I look at it as a film school or a buddy teaching me how to make a film. And I think we can definitely, be inspired by that stuff. And I think the other thing that I get inspired by is I've got a catalog of work that I've created over the years that I put up on YouTube. And it might sound kind of egotistical, but I'll inspire myself on how I can improve what I've done. So I'll look back on films that I've done, 5 years ago, and what that does is it's sort of like an untapped version of myself from the stuff that I'm being influenced by now and where I was kind of at on maybe a cleaner slate and maybe just less talented at that point. And so I'll look at some of the ideas and be like, oh, why don't somebody just do this? And I'm sure you've got this as like a writer. You've probably got all these ideas that you maybe wrote down, 5, 6 years ago in a journal somewhere. And it's kind of fun just to kind of like go back into those and dive into those. I think the number one thing you've created a rabbit hole in my brain. I think the number one thing that I can recommend to anybody or what I do is I just tap into my inner kid. There is this version of ourselves of being like a 6 or 7 year old. And I'm sure you can remember when you're a kid where your brain just kind of goes anywhere. Like I used to be able to grab like a cup of Coke and French fries at McDonald's and they would fight. And my sister would look at me like, what is wrong with him? And to this day, I don't do that. Like I don't make my food and condiments fight anymore. I feel like if I tried hard enough, they could, but I still allow myself to tap into that version of my brain. And it's always been the most creatively freeing in order to tap into new thoughts and ideas.
I'm assuming I have a question that I normally ask, like, have you ever ran out of ideas? But I'm assuming that's not a situation you've ever found yourself in. But I have a quote here of yours. And it says that I'm kind of like an excited dog where I don't know what to go for because I want to go for all of it. So how do you decide what idea should be the next one that you're executing on?
That's a good one. I think actually limitations is the key there. Because there's no shortage of ideas going through my brain. And I'm sure a lot of creative folks who are listening to this, it's probably the same thing. It's like if you can tap into that well is infinite. So what do you choose? Where do you go? And I look at what can I do? Well, I've got these budgetary restrictions. I've got these location restrictions, but not viewing them as restrictions. It's more or less, I've got these guidelines. So redefining the word restriction to guideline, I've got the guideline of these people I can work with. I've got these friends who want to do these things. So right now we're formulating a sci-fi film that I've had in my head for probably 6 or 7 years now. And finally, all of the things are sort of piecing together to perhaps make it. And with whatever money I've got in my bank account and friends to be able to do something. So as far as creative pursuit, I think it goes for what's really at the tip of my tongue. And how I sort of gauge that is I've sort of created like a litmus test for creative pursuit. Like how do I pursue something that I want to do? And what I've done is I've related it to, so there was like a study done by much smarter people than myself to figure out, is it a crush or is it true love? Or is it just like a short stimulant? And they did this with like relationships where they, if you like someone for longer than like, I think it's like 3 months, like if you have a crush longer than 3 months, then it's more most likely to be love. And so I took that. I'm like, is it, could it be the same way for ideas that we have? And I actually found that there's a lot of parallel between how we view crushes or true loves and how we view ideas. For example, a lot of us probably have these ideas that sort of pop in our head as sort of short stimulants that are like, oh, wouldn't it be fun to make a movie about a pencil that talked? I've never had, actually, I have had that idea. That's embarrassing. But that's a short stimulant. That's like going on Hinge, seeing someone who looks attractive and being like, oh, she's hot, and then swiping through, or he's hot, swiping through. Um, then there's the ideas that are the ones that you kind of think about for a few weeks. And that's maybe someone who you go on a few dates with. You're like, maybe there's some potential here. And those are the things that you maybe should give a little bit more attention to. But if it's only in your head for a few weeks and it kind of comes and goes, then it maybe wasn't meant to be. It's not true love. It's not a true crush. It didn't last that long. It's the same as if you met someone, right? But then there's that person or that idea who you've met. You've dated for a few weeks, a few months. You still have a crush on them. It's been 3 months of nonstop thinking about this person or idea. It's been, you tell your friends about it. You can't stop thinking about it. You go to bed, it just twirls in your brain. And it's been like that for months. Then that's love and that's passion towards a project. And I think the parallel between love and a passion idea is so true that it even goes to the point where if you don't pursue that person or if you don't pursue that idea, it's going to destroy you when that idea moves on or when someone else maybe picks that idea up or picks that person up, right? If we see someone who we could have maybe had a potential with, or, we lost them and then they started dating someone else, it hurts. We're like, oh my God, I didn't do the thing. And ideas work the same way. The amount of ideas that I've had and then someone else comes out with a movie about it. And I'm like, oh, I could have done it. Oh, they did it. And so where the ideas that I really try to pursue are the ones that I've sat on for months and they've been brewing, because then I know it's not a stimulant. It's not a short-term crush. It is a love, and it will destroy me if I don't pursue it.
And so do you try to wait? Like, is it the 3 month? Is that kind of like your benchmark for if it's still there after 3 months, similar to the love thing? Or is it just kind of more of an intuitive thing where okay, it's been a while now, I can sit down and try and flush this out?
It's for me, it's the 3 month plus rule. So, if it's a big project, it's probably going to have to sit with me for like a year before I really take it on. Like, for example, this feature that we're writing, the sci-fi feature, it's been over 6 years that I've sat with that idea. And that's when I think it's truly worthwhile to pursue, because what I've recognized, like with Dead Rush, that was something that we quickly did, and because it was done so fast, let's say I was dating that idea for, call it like maybe 2 months, and then I was married to it for a year and a half. It wasn't, it hurt. It was more painful to be in that relationship than it was to pursue it. With other ideas, I've gone crazy over, and I've thought about long enough, because I think, it's a commitment that you have to go into once you've married certain ideas. So I need to make sure that I'm good with it. And that's sort of where I've created a division in sort of my portfolio, where I have YouTube, which not every video I've fallen in love with. They're usually the short stimulants, but luckily it's a format and platform that I can use that as an outlet. So, if it's an idea that I've been kind of toying with for like a week or a few weeks, I'll use YouTube as my outlet, because it's sort of like quick turnaround, boom, 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 go. If it's something that's a longer commitment, let's say like a feature or a short film where I know I'm going to spend like 6 months on it, 6 months plus, then I'll had to have at least had the same duration thinking about it as I will as the duration of execution. So even that can be kind of like a format. It's like if execution can resemble the prep, then it can work.
And so when you're thinking of these ideas, or you finally decide to go for one because you've been thinking about it for long enough, at what point has there ever been a point where you've started working on a project after an extended period of time thinking about it, you got into it, and then you realize, this isn't working, and you have to scrap it after working on it for several days, weeks, or months? And like, what led to you making the decision to scrap a project?
Yeah. So to relate back to like the dating thing, it's like, you can date someone you've fallen in love with, and then all of a sudden, the spark goes, or maybe it just wasn't meant to be, and you move on, and it's painful, but it's less painful than not pursuing it at all. I personally think that it's worthwhile to pursue things out of just living life. If we just don't pursue anything for the fear of failure, then we're never going to do anything. But if we do things to just experience what it could be, we're going to learn from it more than just staying at home and not, stepping forward. And so I think the same thing with ideas. There's many businesses that I've built. I recently just stepped away from a big business that I've been working on for many years. And the same goes for ideas and concepts, things that you sit on for months. We're currently writing a film that just we're hitting our head against the wall on. And, there is a point where now we're starting to think about maybe we take a step away. And it doesn't mean it went for nothing. It's the same deal as you can either break up with someone who you have loved and think, well, that was a waste of, time. And you can just feel completely terrible for the whole thing. Or you can go, yeah, I learned a lot. Those were good years spent. And now it's going to make me a better person for the next person that I meet. Same for a film. I'm going to know more for this next thing that I work on, and it's going to be much better. And so those two trains of thought, while harder, I think, to leverage, to kind of look at the silver lining or the bright side of life, as an annoyingly optimistic person, that's sort of just how I always think. But I really think it is a good strong suit to pursue anything. So that's sort of what I've done. I mean, I'd be curious for your projects that you've worked on. Like, do you feel the same when you go into things?
Yeah. So for me, I think it's a bit of a different process for selecting what the next, I think for me, it's just what am I most excited about? Like I have a list of probably like 100 to 150 ideas written down. And so every time I finish, I go through that list and I see what's sticking out to me the most right now in this moment. And that's what I run with. And that's really my criteria for selecting. And then in terms of like whether I stick with something or not, I've only given out of the 4 I wrote. So I made sure I got first drafts done of all of them. I did second drafts for 2 of them. The first script I wrote, though, when I was doing the rewrite on it, I got halfway through it. I realized it was broken and I didn't have the passion to keep going on it. So I just stepped away from it. Maybe I'll revisit it at some point in the next year or two and see if now that I've put more scripts under my belt, if I can fix it. But I think the biggest thing for me is between rewrites is to give it time to breathe. So I pick a second. So I'll do one script and then I'll step away from it when I finish it and I'll rough draft a second one, like a separate script. That's different from the first script that I wrote. So when I come back, kind of come back with fresh perspective, but having learned a little bit more. But that one, I was just stuck on it. I didn't have the drive to finish it. And I was more compelled to go back and rewrite the second script that I'd written, which is why I moved on from it. I don't know if I'm properly answering your question, but that's like the closest thing I have to a project, why I start projects and why I've stepped away from one. It's just more kind of like a gut feeling more than anything.
Yeah, I'm going to take that as a lesson from your personal experience, because that's what we're going through right now. We've been writing this like horror film and going back and forth, and it's just we keep hitting a wall. And then we decided to dive into the sci-fi idea today. And it's like feels so fresh. We're like, oh my God, like thousands of ideas are pouring in. We're so excited. And I do think there is value in taking distance from things if you can and giving it a breather. And I feel the same thing with, let's say, my YouTube. When my YouTube feels like a pain in the ass, I'll, maybe make a short film or a documentary or whatever. And then I'll go back to my YouTube so excited. And my girlfriend and I talk about this a lot, which is the importance of, let's say, like diversifying your portfolio. And I know it that can come in as like, I guess, like an investment term or like more of a business thing, but I definitely think it can resonate to projects. Like you said, like having multiple scripts on the go. Well, I've heard this term that a friend of mine used, which is like, it's like pushing up a bus, where it's like some people put so much on their plate that you're kind of pushing the weight of all of these things at once. And while I really respect that metaphor, I'm someone who actually operates at a much better pace having multiple things going. I've heard so many podcasts talk about you shouldn't have multiple things going on. It's less productive. I think it's to each their own. I need to have 4 windows open on my computer at once. I need to be editing a photo, editing a video, messaging someone, and probably working on a YouTube thumbnail. That's just how my brain works. And I think it's, who knows, maybe it's being born into a generation of short stimulants or perhaps it's just the fact that it's like creativity thrives on creativity. The more you create one thing, you want to create another, and it's always staying fresh, never getting stagnant with one thing or another. So to your point of writing that one script where it's like, okay, this one I'm starting to get dull and I'm just having a hard time, I'm gonna go to this other one, boom, this thing's going good, and maybe you can look back on that original script with fresh lens. And I find that that can happen on long spurts, whether it's a full script or even like microdosing other projects at the same time to give constantly fresh eyes and refreshing that cycle.
And another thing I felt too not necessarily when I was stuck, but sometimes it would just spark ideas, is I would read like screenwriting books. And then like just going back to those basics and the fundamentals would sometimes spark an idea that I didn't have originally. And that will help me kind of overcome a hurdle I have or find a way to make the script better, is to read a screenwriting book while I'm in the process of writing the script.
What are your screenwriting books?
I read one by Michael Haig. I think that might be the only one I've read. He was Will Smith's script consultant for a while because I had him on the show. And so I read his book before he came on the podcast. I think that's the only one I've read, but I read that when I was doing a couple scripts, and it helped me just think of things in a different lens. But I bought was a Storytelling or whatever by Robert McKee, his main book. I can't remember what it's called, Screenwriting maybe. But I bought Robert McKee's book recently, and I want to buy John Truby's as well. But the only one I've read thus far is Michael Haig's.
Yeah, and what do you like? I've actually never read a screenwriting book. Maybe that's what I'll take from this call, amongst many other things, is to actually go out and read a book about writing. Yeah, because it's interesting that you know when you hit a wall, you can kind of go to a book and reignite a flame through education. And I find that I do that, like, you know, going onto YouTube or watching a master class. But I like the idea of actually being educated through a traditional like screenwriting book, like you said.
Yeah, and I don't let it be the foundation for my writing though. Like I just kind of started writing, like I kind of taught myself how to format, how to do all the things. But it just sometimes, like when you go through that traditional like way of learning about it, like they look at something in a completely different lens, and I take that as inspiration for how to look at my script. But I'm not trying to be like, okay, they say I need to finish Act 1 by page 27, so I got to change my script. Like, that's never it. But it's just using it kind of like as a source of inspiration, because they'll look at a script differently than I'll look at a script, and I'll kind of let those two contrasting ideas birth something new, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's guidance, not being led. Kind of like what we said before, you know, even about criticism and feedback. It's like if you can even take 10% as like tapping you into the direction as opposed to like a full push, you're probably going to get inspired way more. And yeah, I feel like that's where we're at right now. You know, with influencer culture and being over influenced, that's something that I've really battled with, which is how much do I be inspired or influenced by other people, and how much do I go by that internal compass? And I've always found it by like percentages, where it's like, you know, take 10% from what someone else is saying, or 15%, and then take 15% from someone else, and then 15% from someone else, and then use your, you know, your own, not good at math, but you know, your own 40% in that. And that should be the formula. You should never take 90% from someone and be like, I'm just going to throw my 10% flair on it, because that's how you get called out for copying Peter McKinnon.
And that you're opening up a whole other can of worms here that we could go down, because I often wonder, like, are my interests driven by what I'm consuming, or is what I'm consuming driven by my interests? And I often go back and forth on that. Like, I was big into Peter McKinnon and Chris Howe and Matty Hapoy, like all those guys when I was in the photography phase. And I was like, so was I watching them because I was into photography, or did they make me get into photography? And so it's just interesting to kind of that dichotomy of like being over influenced, and how much is that influencing you, and how much are we aware of that it's influencing us. It's a whole other can of worms we could get into.
Yeah, it's a deep dive, man. I actually talked about that this morning, kind of getting into like conspiracy theory with my buddy, is like, are you recommended, like, are you controlling the algorithm, or is the algorithm controlling you? Like when I look at the recommended videos on my YouTube, I'm like, oh wow, I'm really interested in these things. Or am I interested because it decided to put them in my face?
It's probably a combination of both at the end of the day. I don't think it's going to be like it's not a black and white. I think it's somewhere in the gray is what the real answer to that question will be. But I know we're over time here, and I want to be respectful of your time. So I'm going to jump to my last couple questions here. One of them being is like, how often do you kind of look back and reflect on the whole journey? You know, going back to those days on the farm, making videos, to Wild Ram Films, to the amazing basement show, to where you are now. Like, how often do you look back on the whole journey?
Wow, dude, you've done your research. I admire the effort you put into this. This is so cool. Um, I am a true believer in looking back on things. I write journals every single day. I read my journal from like 2 years ago or 3 years ago once a week. And I like to look at my old stuff because I think the blueprint to how we're created can be more inspiring than looking at the projected path that we try to illustrate. You know, when you look at most therapy that people do, self help, retreats, a lot of the self work that we do, while yes, it is for projecting what we want to be, that can only be determined by when we look at our past and when we look at what childhood traumas did I have? What did I grow up with? What were the things that made me? And while I think of it as like three circles, like the external circle is what we're currently being influenced by. The middle circle, like by like media and art and film and whatever, that medium circle, the semicircle in there is like parents and that's the sum of five, those people who are around you, and that inner circle is our past, the things that like we grew up with that carved out who we are. It was the problems that we grew from, a death in the family, being bullied as a kid. And like all the other influences, if we disregard our past, we're kind of disregarding the blueprint that create us and kind of being ignorant to how we actually operate. Good therapists and good therapy say that we're controlled by the inner 6-year-old inside ourselves, or at least that's what some of the best feedback that I've gotten from life coaches and stuff is that. And so if that's truly the mechanics on how we work, then I really love looking at where was I at? What are these things, the core foundations to what created me? And I really learned to leverage that when I wrote my book, which was I dove into the young Zach that grew up on the farm with the food allergies. And the more I wrote about that kid, the more I actually learned who I was and why I'm doing things now. And it really helped me grasp what kind of things I want to do in the future. Because you can either be, future, like my future setting to what I found before I started doing any deep work was that I was just stealing what other successful people were accomplishing. I was looking at like, bad example, but I was looking at like Jeff Bezos or like Elon Musk, and I'm like, oh, this is success, so I'm going to try and make my roadmap off of them. But if I root it back to uninfluenced Zach, which was 6 or 7-year-old Zach growing up on the farm shooting videos with Rob, I look at him, his inspiration was not at all what those things were. It was just to have fun and be creative. And if the truest forms of joy of myself were those versions of the kid who was kind of uninfluenced by anything sort of dark or things like money or whatever, and it was just sort of pure joy, like at the end of the day, I always just want to tap into pure joy. So I'm always going to try and be influenced by young Zach as opposed to projected millionaire Zach who I think should be happy. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's sort of where I try to aim for as far as inspiration.
No, that definitely resonates. And so I'm curious now, kind of with that in mind and knowing that you're always trying to trace back to your 6 or 7-year-old self. The last question I ask at the end of every interview is actually not even me asking the question. It's you asking the question, but it's not to me. So pretend you have a crystal ball. You can ask this crystal ball any question. You'll get the 100% honest answer. What is one question you'd want to know the answer to?
The question that I typically ask myself often is, am I on the right path?
Okay, interesting. I like that question. I didn't know if you were going to take it somewhere and like ask your 6 or 7-year-old self a question or what your 6-year-old, 7-year-old self would think.
Oh, interesting. I could ask the 6-year-old self that question.
Or would your 6 or 7-year-old self think you're on the right path? That's something I often wonder. Like, what would if my younger self think of the current version of me?
I actually think I'm doing everything that I wanted to do. Like I'm just living the big kid version of that. And I think I ask myself that a lot, and I try to dive back to that young version of me because I'm trying to be accountable to what joy is in its purest form, and that's what young me kind of thrived for. Outside of like candy bars and shit, like what I really liked back then, and filming horses, I still do the same thing. But outside of like stimulants and like low hanging fruit things that gave me joy, like video games and candy, it was the the pursuit of being creative and having fun. And I try to be accountable to that as much as possible. But, it's like any sort of work though, man. It's like just because you're doing it today doesn't mean you're going to get it done tomorrow. And so I try to ask myself those questions and live up to that accountability every day, because it is as much as making money and putting cash in the bank or making a project is work, so is being true to yourself. It's not just like, oh, you did it. You just worked out at the gym and now you got a hot bod and you don't have to work out or whatever again. You have to do it consistently if that's what you want. And so, yeah, I feel like I hit it every day, and of course I hit a wall, and I feel like I'm off track, and that young version of myself is like disappointed in me. But I always look back and go, okay, like I'm gonna try and do work again to try and accomplish something that will make that kid happy.
I love that, man. I love that. I think that's a great spot to wrap up this this first of many conversations. I will say we could definitely have to have you back on the show at some point. I got lots of more questions here that I had, but I want to give you the floor, man. Where can the people find you? Plug anything and everything you got right now.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. And dude, I love this conversation. I cannot wait to see you in 3-dimensional space in real life at some point. I feel like
100%.
it'd be super cool.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. And as far as stuff goes, I have, like I said many times, a lot of stuff that you and I discussed in this chat are actually chapters out of my book. And I think it was kind of unintentional, but it ended up working out pretty well. Authenticity, originality, pursuing your own voice, and communicating with that young version of yourself. I wrote a whole book about this, The Unoriginal Guide to Being Original, and I have a wait list for the book that people can join. I'm assuming, do you have show notes and stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll make sure it's all linked down there.
Okay, I won't go into go to https:// dash. So I've got that on my website. My YouTube is Zach Ramelan. You can take a look at a lot of the long list of videos, kind of in this similar fashion. And everything that we discussed is sort of visually and represented through that, as well as written format in the book. The book has been a big passion project of mine for the past 3 years, and I'm so excited to have it done and out there. And if your listeners gained anything from our chat, it's just a more filtered and edited version of what we chatted about of 3 years of writing and editing into one single book.
Amazing. Well, I'll make sure it's linked in the show notes down below so people can go get on that wait list. They can subscribe to your YouTube. They can follow you on social media. And I want to thank you once again, man, for taking time to come on the podcast. I want to thank everybody for listening, whether you've listened the entire way through or you only listen to bits and pieces. I really appreciate you taking time to check this out. Do me a big favor. Go and join the wait list for Zach's book. Like I said, it'll be linked in the show notes down below so you can find it. If you'd like to follow me, you can find me everywhere on social media at the Jacob Kelly. Feel free to come and say hello. My DMs are always open. As always, today's podcast is powered by Surf. Thank you once again for listening. We'll talk soon.